Coming to you now is Lechem Panim with your host, Pastor Cameron Ury, Senior Pastor and Bible Teacher at Renton Park Chapel in Renton, Washington.
Greetings. Welcome to the show. It's good to have you with us, as always. Our passage today comes from the book of John, chapter 1, verses 43 to 44. It reads, "The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, 'Follow me.' Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida." We've been talking in recent weeks about the reality that any time Jesus has truly touched our lives, anytime we have truly experienced who he is, what he has done for us, our immediate response is always to go out, find somebody else that needs his touch, and tell them about him. And the next disciple that Jesus calls also has this same drive, this same spirit. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and look with me starting at verse 43. It says, "The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee." Now, Galilee was a highly unusual place for a good Jewish rabbi to begin his ministry because way back in the Old Testament, Israel, if you remember, it was carried away into captivity by Assyria. And so when the Jews in Galilee were carried away, they were replaced by a colony of pagan immigrants. We see that in 2 Kings 15:29 and as well as chapter 17, verse 24. That's why it became known as Galilee of the Nations, or Galilee of the Gentiles. Now, even though Jews returned to Galilee after the captivity, it still remained predominantly Gentile, and therefore was, in the Jewish mind, unclean. And so because of that pagan influence, you could tell a Galilean by his accent. And this unholy mix, it caused the southern Jews of purer blood and Orthodox tradition to despise the Galileans. So why would a good Jewish rabbi, much less the Messiah, the Son of God, why would he choose this region as the place to begin his ministry? I read an author some time ago who said that Galilee's very darkness was the Lord's reason for granting more of the light of his presence and ministry to this region than to self-satisfied and privileged Judea. Christ was sent for a light for the Gentiles, Isaiah 42:6, as well as to the lost sheep of Israel, Matthew 15:24. He said, Galilee's very debasement made some of its people feel more acutely their need of the Savior. Now, you know what that says to me? Jesus comes to those whose hearts are aching for him. He will not come first to those who feel satisfied. No, he comes to those who, having come to the realization that they are lost without him, cry out for his touch. And even while that cry is still on our lips, he is already in our midst. And we don't have Philip's backstory, and therefore we don't know why Jesus came to Philip. All we know is that Jesus intentionally goes to Galilee and apparently seeks Philip out. And it says in verse 43, finding Philip, he, Jesus, said to him, "Follow me." And what this shows us is that no matter who we are, where we live, what it is we're going through, or what it is we're struggling with, when our hearts cry out for Jesus, he will find us and he will lift us up. Now it says of Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. And actually, Andrew, James the elder, the Apostle John, Simon Peter, and Philip, they were all from Bethsaida. Though Peter and Andrew, they had relocated to Capernaum. And in Mark chapter 1, verses 21 and 29, we find that Andrew lived with his brother Peter and Peter's wife in Peter's house. Remember, Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law in Mark 1:31. She was staying with them. And this house has been discovered, and you can go see it even today, which I have. But both Bethsaida and Capernaum, they were fishing villages on the northern coast of Galilee. In fact, Bethsaida means house of fishing. Sounds like my kind of place. And, I've been to the coast of Galilee. I've witnessed the people there still fishing those same waters. And I've gotten to eat some of that fish in a restaurant there. I prefer my fish headless. The one that was served to me was not. I don't like food that looks at me, by the way. But nevertheless, it was fascinating for me to watch the people there, millennia later, still bringing forth that harvest from the sea in order to sell and trade. And these fishing villages, like Bethsaida, like Capernaum, they were important places because they resided on the main highway, the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea, that brought traffic from the coastal hills of Judea to the northern regions of the country. And so they did not only sell fresh fish locally, but they exported fish as well. In fact, one of Bethsaida's chief exports was dried freshwater fish. During that time, you had only tilapia, sardines, and eel in the Sea of Galilee. And eel was unclean to eat. So when Jesus talks about separating the unclean fish from the clean fish, he means take the eels out. But you'll remember that in the feeding of the 5,000, which took place only about 9 miles away from Bethsaida, a small boy approaches with 5 loaves, 2 small fish, and those 2 fish were most likely a couple of these dried sardines, a little protein to go along with his bread. And so we see that many of the disciples have this kind of industry in their background, most likely Philip as well. So this is the kind of place where Philip grew up. Now imagine this. Jesus walks up to Philip, probably greets him. Philip probably greets him back and says, "Hello, good sir, what's your name and where do you hail from?" He says, "Well, my name is Jesus." "Oh, that's right. You're that rabbi from Nazareth. I've heard of you. I'm deeply honored to meet you. What can I do for you?" "Come, follow me. Come, be my disciple." Can you imagine? I mean, Philip has never even met Jesus before. Jesus comes all the way up from Judea, and the scriptures say he finds Philip, which implies, by the way, that he was looking for him. And he says, "Follow me." I don't know about you, but it always seemed to me that Jesus kind of chose his disciples randomly, just based on wherever he happened to be. But that's not the case. Here we see that Jesus, he's very intentional about the disciples he chooses. There is nothing random. He comes to Galilee, and not only because that's where he's going to start his ministry, no, he goes specifically to Bethsaida to handpick his first disciples. And we're often tempted to think that our coming to Christ was random, but that's not true. Christ has specifically chosen each and every one of us for a special plan and purpose. He's handpicked us for a special task. He's handpicked you for a special task. And I don't know about you, but that's a great comfort to me to know that my following Christ, it wasn't a random decision with little to no aim in mind, but Christ sought out each and every one of us in order to bless us and to call us to follow him into life. Now, I would have loved to see Philip's reaction to Christ's call. It must have been one of fascination and awe because we have no other explanation than that Philip obeys that call. Hey, a rabbi called me. Sure, I'm going to follow him. That was an amazing thing in that culture. But apparently his own personal experience of Jesus, his experiencing Jesus for himself, that's what he needed the most. And so he begins to follow Jesus. And as anyone who has encountered Jesus must do, as we've said many times before, he has to go and tell somebody. And of course he goes to tell Nathanael, which we'll talk about in the coming weeks. But not long ago, I read a historical story that was shared by Warren Wiersbe. Britain's King George V was going to give the opening address at a special disarmament conference with a speech relayed by radio to the U.S. And as the broadcast was about to begin, a cable that ran to the generator that powered the whole broadcast, it broke in the New York radio station. Somebody having tripped over it. Imagine that. And more than 1 million listeners were left without sound. And a junior mechanic in the station, NYNBC radio engineer Harold Vivian, he solved the problem by picking up both ends of the cable and allowing 250 volts of electricity to pass through him. And though his body twitched with spasms, he held on in pain for 20 minutes until new wires could be connected. He was the living link that allowed the king's message to get through to the people. This morning, I want you to imagine yourself as that living link between Jesus and those who need to hear about him. That, like that cable, allows his message to come through and touch their lives. You and I, whether we realize it or not, are often God's means of allowing the very voice of Jesus to be heard. And yet sometimes the worst thing we can do, we end up doing, and that is to remain silent. There was a court case that was lost because of the silence of an attorney. Samuel Hoer He was representing the defendant, and when it was time to present his case, he told the jurors that the facts favoring his client were so evident that he would not insult their intelligence by arguing them. So the jury retired to deliberate and returned in a few minutes with a verdict of guilty. And Samuel Hoare was astonished. How, he asked, could you have reached such a verdict? And the foreman replied, well, we all agreed that if anything could be said for a case, you would say it. But since you didn't present any evidence, we decided to rule against you. Silence had lost the case. How often the opportunity to speak a word of testimony for Christ is lost because we remain silent. Those who need to hear the gospel, they may conclude that salvation is not really important enough to talk about. That's why it's so important for us to speak up, to be that link that connects people with the voice and presence of Jesus. Through your life, through your witness, people come face to face with Jesus. And that may be the only time they ever encounter Jesus, is through an interaction with you. One of the most powerful tools that you can give is not just preaching at them, which is often not the best way to start a conversation, but simply sharing with them your testimony, how you came to Christ, what a difference it made in your life. They may be able to disagree with something you preach at them, but they can't argue with your own personal experience. Why? Because it's your experience. And it's a way for you to share truth with them without them, getting defensive or feeling attacked. This is simply what Jesus has done in your life. And if you don't have your testimony written out or prepared to share, I want to encourage you, write your testimony out this week. Sit down with your iPad or your iPhone or your computer board, or if you're old school, with a pad of paper and a pencil. Write out your testimony. Rehearse it. Make it short. Don't make it exhaustive. But write it out. How Jesus has impacted your life. We are all Christians because of the ministry of somebody else. I guarantee it. None of us has come to Christ on our own merit. All of us came because of the ministry of somebody else. And that was because of Christ, in and through that person, seeking to save you and to call you to come follow him. Now the question is, who is Christ calling you and I to bring to him? Who is Christ burdening our hearts for? Are we going to allow Christ to use us to bring those people to him? This week I want to challenge you once again. Find who that person is, begin praying for them, and look for opportunities to share with them the life you have found in Jesus. Amen.
Today's episode of Lechem Panim has been made possible by Renton Park Chapel, a church that is committed to the ministry of sharing the joy of hearing and doing God's Word, and to the mission of bringing people into the life-giving presence of Jesus Christ in and through vibrant preaching, teaching, Bible study, prayer, and ministry to a world that is in desperate need of the healing touch of Jesus Christ. If you'd like to learn more about our ministry here at Renton Park Chapel, or would like to request any of our messages here on Lechem Panim, you can visit us online at rentonparkchapel.org or lechempanim.org. You can also find us on both Facebook and Twitter. We look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for listening. And may you know all the fullness of having in your life the bread of the presence of God.